Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
The whole living room went quiet when I leaned in and kissed her cheek. I smiled because it was over. Not the war that had ended years ago, but the performance. She wanted a show? I gave her one. And when I whispered those 8 little words, her wine glass didn't even make it back to the table. My mother had invited me here just to say, "You're not getting a penny from me." What she didn't know. I didn't need it. I already owned more than she ever did. And now she knew it too. It all started with an envelope, thick, embossed, and smelling like money, or rather the kind of money that prefers to wear pearls at breakfast and uses the word tasteful like a weapon. It landed in my mailbox on a Thursday, wedged between a jury summons I planned to ignore and a coupon for lawn furniture I'd never use. No return address, of course, just my name written in cold, immaculate calligraphy that practically screamed, "Mother." I should have thrown it out. I should have lit a match and let the flames take it like all the other chances she never gave me, but some part of me, some twisted, masochistic piece, was curious enough to peel it open with the corner of my nail and read what she had to say. Dinner. Saturday. 6 o'clock. No +1. That was it. Not even a love or sincerely. Just the implied elegance of someone who thinks their presence is its own signature. I hadn't seen her in nearly 5 years. The last time we'd been in the same room, she said my business idea was cute and asked if I needed her to call someone to help me get a real job. I had just launched my second company. She didn't know that, of course. She never asked. She never wanted updates unless they could be packaged into something she could brag about at brunch. And I never gave her the satisfaction. But this invitation was different. It wasn't her style to reach out. She preferred her silences with the finality of a tune. If Diana was inviting me, it meant something was coming. And if I'd learned anything growing up in her house, it was that everything she did was calculated. She didn't sneeze unless it made someone else feel small. So of course I said yes. The house was exactly as I remembered it, clean to the point of sterility, like even dust knew not to exist under her roof. The hedges were trimmed like soldiers. The driveway had been repaved, probably for the 3rd time in 5 years. A new sculpture sat in the front garden, some abstract piece that looked like a melted violin. Expensive. Useless. Just like most things in her life. The front door opened before I even reached the steps. I hadn't rung the bell. She must have been watching from the window, something she always did but never admitted. "Rachel," she said, not with warmth, but with the cadence of someone performing friendliness in front of witnesses. "You're early." "I figured you'd appreciate punctuality," I replied, stepping inside. The air was thick with that familiar citrus and judgment scent she always sprayed before guests arrived. Everything was curated. Even me. The dining room looked like a magazine spread. Long mahogany table, candles that probably cost more than my rent in college, glasses that clinked like secrets. And seated around it were the usual suspects, my Uncle Steve, Aunt Lila, Cousin Becca, and, of course, my brother Evan, looking like a J.Crew mannequin who'd just gotten promoted. They all turned when I walked in. The silence was sharp, like they'd been mid-sentence and saw a ghost. Or maybe just someone they thought had been buried under a pile of failures. No one stood to greet me. Not even Evan, who used to call me sis, with fake affection in public and silence behind closed doors. His smirk was the only movement in the room, and even that felt forced. Mother gestured to an empty seat. "I saved you a spot." "How thoughtful," I said, lowering myself into the chair like I was stepping onto thin ice. I noticed the wine had already been poured, white, dry, cold. Just like her. The toast came quickly. She raised her glass and said, "To family." Even the wayward ones. They all laughed, some nervously, others with full conviction. I smiled, because it was the only weapon I needed tonight. The food was impeccable. Of course it was. She wouldn't have dared serve anything less than perfection when there were mouths present to judge her worth. But every bite felt like chewing glass. The small talk danced around me like I was invisible, except when it wasn't. "So, Rachel, what are you doing these days?" Lila asked with a sugar-coated grin that didn't quite reach her Botoxed eyes. "Oh, This and that, I said, swirling the wine. A few things in tech. Some property here and there. Still chasing dreams? Evan chimed in, with that polished condescension he wore like cufflinks. I remember when you wanted to be a writer or what was it? Yoga instructor. That was 15 years ago, I said. And I still do yoga. Keeps me flexible. In more ways than one. The conversation sputtered and shifted back to safer terrain, Steve's new golf course, Becca's upcoming wedding, and some yacht trip no one asked about. I waited. I watched. And I smiled when I saw her reach for the envelope beneath the table. She passed it down like it was a casual footnote. It landed beside my plate with a soft thud. I wanted to give you this in person, she said. So there are no misunderstandings. I opened it slowly. It was a formal declaration, notarized and everything, stating that I would not be included in any division of assets, property, or residual inheritance. In short, you're not getting a penny from me. The room stilled. No one breathed. Even Evan looked surprised, not by the decision, but by the spectacle of it. This wasn't just a cut, it was a public execution. I folded the paper calmly and set it back on the table. Well, I said, lifting my glass, that certainly clears things up. And I drank. Not because I needed the alcohol, but because I knew what was coming next, and so would they. They just didn't see it yet. Under the table, my phone buzzed. I glanced down. 2 words lit up the screen. It's done. And that was the first moment I let myself smile, not politely, not performatively, but fully, with teeth. Because they had no idea what was coming. Not yet. The moment I slid my phone back into my clutch, still warm from the vibration and the simple finality of the message, it's done, I understood that the rest of the evening was going to be a performance, a long, drawn-out scene in which I was expected to play the role of the humiliated daughter, graciously accepting her public disownment like a well-mannered disgrace who had the decency to vanish quietly after the final act. But what no one at that table realized, not Evan with his barely contained smirk, not Aunt Lila with her brittle attempts at smiling through the tension, not even my mother with her perfectly timed cruelty masked as composed elegance, was that I had not come here to beg, nor had I shown up out of some naive hope for reconciliation or inclusion, but rather, I was here to look each one of them in the eye as I turned their little kingdom on its head. The dinner resumed in the awkward quiet that follows a slap no one acknowledges, but everyone heard, with the clink of silverware against porcelain plates filling the space where pleasantries once lived, though now those pleasantries had been poisoned, gutted, and laid bare in front of a family that had always preferred performance to truth. I watched them try to recover, Uncle Steve launching into a story about a charity gala as if nothing had happened, Aunt Lila nodding too enthusiastically, clearly overcompensating, while Becca asked Evan about his latest consulting project, which he gladly inflated with buzzwords and exaggerated revenue figures, as if padding his worth could distract from the bombshell our mother had dropped just moments ago. Diana herself remained calm, or at least gave the appearance of calm, cutting into her Chilean sea bass with the kind of precision reserved for surgeons and psychopaths, and I knew her well enough to see that she was enjoying this moment, the assertion of dominance. The way everyone's eyes flicked back to me for a reaction, as if they expected me to crack or lash out or maybe just melt into a puddle of shame that could be wiped up with a cloth napkin before dessert. But I wasn't 15 anymore. I wasn't the girl who cried in the laundry room when Evan got a car for his 16th birthday and I got a lecture on independence. I wasn't the college dropout who came home one Thanksgiving with a beat-up laptop and a startup idea, only to be laughed out of the room and told, "Not everyone's meant for success, dear." I wasn't the woman who had spent years living small, scraping by, building something real in the dark while they basked in the comfort of trust funds and social capital and name recognition they had never earned. I was something else now, something they had never considered a threat because they had never really considered me at all. "So, Rachel," Diana said suddenly, her voice slicing through the air like a paper cut you don't notice until you bleed, "now that things are transparent, I do hope this means you can move on with your life. I imagine it's exhausting, still trying to prove something to people who've long since stopped paying attention." The bait was subtle, wrapped in civility and dipped in condescension, but I saw the twitch in her cheek, the way her fingers curled ever so slightly around the base of her wine glass. She wasn't just enjoying herself. She was trying to win. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, something that would have earned me a glare in any other moment of my childhood, and said, in a tone just loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's the thing, Mother. I stopped trying to prove anything to you a long time ago. I've been busy doing something far more productive." Evan chuckled. "Let me guess, another app? A vegan cookbook? No offense, but you're not exactly known for following through." I looked at him, this man who had been spoon-fed connections, whose idea of hardship was flying business class instead of private, and I almost felt sorry for how unprepared he was. "You know that little AI firm you consult for?" I asked casually, watching the color drain half a shade from his smug face. He blinked. "Yeah, I own it." The words didn't land immediately. There was a beat of silence, like the air itself was trying to make sense of what had just been said, and then I watched the confusion settle into his brow, followed by disbelief, and finally the slow, creeping realization that I wasn't bluffing. "You what?" "I bought the parent company last quarter," I continued, sipping my wine like I was discussing the weather. "Through a holding group, of course, so the employees wouldn't panic. You've been reporting to me for 3 months now, though your last memo was unimpressive." The silence that followed was visceral. Steve's fork froze midair. Becca actually gasped. Lila's hand flew to her chest in that dramatic way she always did when someone mentioned politics or the stock market crashed. And Diana, my mother, stared at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before, uncertainty. Evan stammered, then recovered with a weak laugh. "You're lying." I pulled my phone from my bag, opened the secured portfolio app, and turned the screen toward him. There, in black and white, were the receipts, documents, board appointments, transfer confirmations. His name, my title. All of it. "I'm not," I said, almost gently, as if the truth needed padding. The room pulsed with tension. No one knew what to say, so no one said anything. Diana finally broke the silence. "That's unexpected." "Not for me," I said, locking eyes with her. "For years, I let all of you believe I was the failure. That I was lost. That I needed saving. But what I needed was space. You gave me exile, and I used it." I stood, my chair sliding back with a long groan across the marble floor, and the sound was so loud in the silence that it felt like thunder in a cathedral. "Thank you all for dinner," I said. "It's been enlightening." And as I walked toward the hallway, my phone buzzed again, another message, this one more cryptic than the last. Just one word. Tomorrow. I didn't look back. Because whatever tomorrow was bringing, it wasn't going to be quiet. By the time I closed the door behind me and stepped into the guest bathroom, the kind of sterile, soulless powder room my mother kept more for display than utility, I could still feel the heat of their stares trailing behind me like a tide that had pulled back, but would soon come roaring in with vengeance. I locked the door out of instinct, not because I was afraid, God no, not anymore, but because I needed a brief moment of solitude to recenter myself after dropping the first bomb and watching the fractures ripple outward through the family like hairline cracks on porcelain about to shatter. I set my clutch down on the marble counter, took a long, steadying breath, and looked into the mirror, not to check my makeup or assess my composure, because I already knew both were perfectly intact, but because sometimes, after years of becoming someone no one expected you to become, you need to make eye contact with the version of yourself you spent a decade building in secret. The woman staring back at me wasn't the girl who used to hide in library corners and try to shrink herself smaller just to avoid the sting of being the afterthought in every family conversation. No, the woman in the mirror knew what she had, what she owned, what she controlled. And tonight, that truth was no longer a secret. I'd spent years living like a ghost in their narrative, cast as the disappointment, the dreamer, the one who never quite figured it out. And while they were busy attending charity galas and booking weekends in Aspen to gossip about which heiress was falling apart this month, I was teaching myself to code in a rental unit with faulty heating, working 3 freelance jobs while sleeping 4 hours a night, and slowly but ruthlessly carving out a space in the world that no one could take from me. Not even the woman who once told me I'd peaked at 17. They had no idea that the first check I ever wrote to myself came from flipping a domain name I'd bought for $10 and sold to a marketing firm for $10,000 2 years later. They didn't know that my first LLC was registered under a name that meant nothing to them, a name that would later hold real estate in 5 states, a startup in Singapore, and, eventually, their golden boy's salary contract. Every insult they hurled at me over the years, every backhanded comment, every exclusion, every look exchanged behind wine glasses whenever I dared to bring up my projects, had only made me more precise, more calculating, more disciplined in my silence. In the early days, when I was still trying to prove something, I'd kept tabs on all of them. I'd tracked Evan's career trajectory not because I admired it, but because I needed to know where he was weakest. I studied my mother's investments, read between the lines in every family newsletter she sent out like a corporate quarterly update, and when I realized that her lavish lifestyle was propped up by a mountain of leveraged properties and shallow partnerships, I made my move, not out of spite, but out of sheer opportunity. The holding group I formed wasn't just a shell. It was a carefully orchestrated ensemble of silent partners, legal loopholes, and anonymous boards that allowed me to move without drawing attention, to buy what I wanted without leaving fingerprints, to build an empire right under their noses while they laughed over champagne about how I still hadn't settled down. Every time I was left off a holiday card, I closed another deal. Every time Diana introduced Evan as her only real success, I signed another acquisition. And the property. Oh, the property. When I first saw that one particular estate, Diana's favorite, the crown jewel of her curated identity, the one she loved to parade in magazines and Christmas letters, I didn't think I'd ever touch it. But then came the foreclosure rumors, the whispers of refinancing, the quiet desperation tucked behind her pearls and practiced smiles. I didn't swoop in with a dramatic offer or even use my name. I had one of my subsidiaries purchase the mortgage from a shaky lender she'd leaned on too heavily. She never even noticed the ownership change. She just kept writing checks, assuming she was still in control, while I sat back and watched her pour her money into my bank account month after month. She'd been paying me indirectly for nearly a year. And tonight was just the beginning. I picked up my phone and opened the secured folder where I kept the documents, titles, transfer confirmations, shell agreements, bank records. All perfectly legal, all airtight, all designed for one moment. Tomorrow. The second message that had buzzed while I left the dinner table was from my lawyer. Everything was finalized. The house was mine. The estate was mine. The narrative? That was mine too now. A knock on the bathroom door jolted me slightly. Rachel? Becca's voice, thin and cautious, came through like someone approaching a sleeping lion with a stick. Are you okay? I took one more look at myself, not to assess damage, but to confirm what I already knew, that nothing about me tonight was uncertain. Just needed a moment, I replied, voice steady, firm, and unmistakably in control. When I returned to the table, I could feel the shift. Evan was pale, his hands clenched under the table like he was trying to anchor himself in a reality that no longer made sense. Lila was whispering something to Steve, her voice too low to catch, but her eyes wide with that desperate curiosity rich people get when they realize their social hierarchy might be rearranged. And Diana. Diana was sipping her wine slower now, with the faintest twitch at the corner of her jaw, like someone who'd just tasted something bitter and wasn't ready to admit it. No one spoke to me as I took my seat. No one knew what to say. So I said it for them. I'm curious, I began, letting the pause settle just long enough. When exactly did you all decide I was worthless? Diana didn't flinch, but she didn't answer either. Because I'd love to know what the metric was. Was it when I moved out at 19 with 2 suitcases and no plan? Was it when I refused to come home for Christmas because you made a toast to Evan's promotion and forgot I was even in the room? Or was it when I started my first business and you said it sounded like a phase? I don't recall saying that, Diana murmured. You never do, I said, smiling, because I wanted them to remember this moment, not as the night they cut me out, but as the night I let them know I'd already been out, on my own terms, for a long, long time. And just like that, dessert was served. Tiramisu. Her favorite. But for once, it didn't taste sweet. The clink of dessert spoons against fine china had never sounded so forced, so awkwardly timed, so distinctly performative, as it did in that moment when each of them tried, in their own shallow way, to salvage the evening from the wreckage of my earlier revelation, a desperate orchestra of pleasantries and hollow compliments playing beneath the surface of a dinner that had already capsized. I sat back in my chair, letting the quiet chaos unfold, watching them all twist uncomfortably in their seats as they attempted to regain some semblance of hierarchy. Each one unwilling to acknowledge the most obvious truth that now hung over the room like a chandelier threatening to fall. Diana had lost control, and they didn't know what to do without her iron grip guiding the performance. Evan, of course, recovered first, as I knew he would, because if there's one thing my brother had mastered over the years, it was the art of repackaging humiliation as sarcasm, wrapping insecurity in a thin layer of bravado and passing it off as indifference. He leaned forward slightly, his fork pausing just above the plate as he looked at me with that smirk he used to wear in high school, the one that made girls trust him and teachers tolerate him. "So let me get this straight," he said, drawing the words out like he was savoring them. "You secretly bought out my company, and somehow I'm supposed to be, what? Impressed? Grateful? Scared?" I didn't answer immediately, because I knew he was stalling, trying to regroup, trying to reassert dominance in a room where the power dynamic had already shifted without his permission. Instead, I tilted my head, studying him like a stranger, because in many ways that's exactly what he had become, an overconfident puppet with a pedigree, unaware that the strings he thought he controlled had long since been cut. "I don't need you to feel anything, Evan," I said finally, my voice calm but deliberate, each syllable landing with the weight of inevitability. "I just wanted you to know, because it's important to me that, for once in your life, you understand that you didn't win." The words hit him harder than I expected. For a moment, just a flicker, his face dropped, the smirk faded, the eyes narrowed, the facade cracked, and then, just as quickly, he tried to laugh it off, though even that sounded hollow, like a balloon slowly losing air in the corner of a party no one wanted to be at anymore. "You're delusional," he muttered, stabbing his fork into the tiramisu like it had personally betrayed him. "You've always been delusional." And yet, I replied, leaning back and crossing one leg over the other, "Here we are." It wasn't just about the company, and he knew it. It wasn't even about the inheritance or the years of condescension or the endless comparisons that had been stacked against me like weights on a scale I was never meant to balance. It was about the fact that I had done what none of them had believed I could do, succeeded on my own terms, in silence, without applause or approval or a single drop of their precious validation. And now that the mask had been removed, they were flailing, desperate to find a new script, a new narrative that still placed them at the center of the story. Diana, who had remained unusually quiet through this exchange, finally set down her glass and spoke, her voice a shade colder than before, more precise, more dangerous. "You always were dramatic, Rachel," she said, as if that were the worst thing a person could be, "and I see that hasn't changed. You've made your point. You've embarrassed your family. You've interrupted what should have been a peaceful evening. What more do you want?" And there it was, the question she had never asked when it mattered, the question she had always avoided because the answer terrified her. What do I want? As if that had ever occurred to her. As if my needs, my ambitions, my identity had ever been anything more than an inconvenience to be managed or a rebellion to be punished. I looked at her, really looked at her, the way I hadn't in years. There was something different in her eyes, something that might have been fear, though she would never allow it to rise to the surface. Her grip on the stem of her glass was too tight, her posture just a little too stiff, her lips pressed together in a line that threatened to collapse. For the first time, she looked small. "I don't want anything from you," I said quietly, and the simplicity of the statement made it all the more devastating. "I never did. That was the part you never understood. You thought you were the prize, that your money or your approval was something I spent my life chasing, but the truth is, I stopped chasing you the moment I realized you couldn't give what you didn't have." Her eyes narrowed. "And what is it you think I don't have?" "Love," I said. "Kindness. Humanity. You gave us performance. You gave us curated moments. You gave us expectations we could never meet. But you never gave us you. The room was silent again, but this time it was different. This time, no one dared to speak, because they knew, on some level, they all knew, that what I was saying wasn't cruel, or exaggerated, or even unfair. It was simply true. Diana pushed back from the table slowly, her chair groaning against the floor, and for a moment I thought she might cry, but of course she didn't. She stood there, composed and hollow, a porcelain figure cracking from the inside, and she said, "You've made your choices, Rachel. Don't expect this family to save you when they catch up to you." "I didn't come here to be saved," I said. "I came here to show you that I didn't need saving." I walked toward her then, not out of affection, but out of closure, and as I passed, I leaned in, close enough for her to feel the warmth of my breath against her ear. I whispered something then, just a few quiet words, that made her flinch, though no one else heard them. I watched her swallow hard, watched her eyes widen ever so slightly, and then I stepped back. The whisper had done what nothing else could. Diana sat down and said nothing. Behind me, I heard Evan rise, probably ready to defend her, to reassert whatever dominance he thought still existed, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because tomorrow was coming. And with it, the final blow. Morning came not with the gentle arrival of sunlight or the promise of a fresh start, but with the sharp precision of intention, the kind of daybreak that doesn't ask for your participation, but simply arrives, fully formed, fully loaded, indifferent to whether or not you're ready. I didn't sleep that night, not because of nerves or regret or the weight of what had happened, but because I hadn't needed rest. I had needed stillness, and in the quiet hours between midnight and the dawn, I found a clarity that had eluded me for years, maybe for most of my life. I sat in the guest house Diana never let anyone use, the one she claimed was not quite finished, but was, in fact, perfect down to the last curated throw pillow, and I thought about everything that had led me here. Not just the betrayals or the silences or the dinners where I was a prop at best and a problem at worst, but the choices I made when no one was watching, the sacrifices, the cold breakfasts, the lonely victories that tasted like ash because I had no one to share them with. And still, I wouldn't have changed a thing. By the time the morning news alert lit up my phone, I was already dressed, already packed, already prepared for what I knew would follow. The headline wasn't loud or dramatic, just a simple financial report about a quiet acquisition that had gone mostly unnoticed in the broader market, buried under stories about celebrity divorces and rising interest rates. But for those who knew where to look, those who understood what names meant in certain circles, the implications were deafening. The house, Diana's beloved estate, the one she paraded to society like a trophy of taste and superiority, had changed hands. Quietly. Legally. Entirely. It belonged to me now. And with that one move, the ground beneath her world had shifted, not because she would lose the property, her money would insulate her from discomfort for the rest of her life, but because she would lose the narrative. The version of events she had curated for decades, the fantasy where she reigned untouched by consequence, where I was merely a shadow lurking behind Evan's spotlight, that version had finally crumbled. And she would have to live with the truth that the daughter she had tried to erase had rewritten the story in ink that could not be washed away. When I returned to the main house, I didn't expect an audience, but I found one nonetheless. The dining room, still heavy with the ghosts of last night's confessions, had been set for breakfast, though no one had touched a single item. Diana sat at the head of the table, her back impossibly straight, her eyes unreadable, while Evan stood to the side near the window, arms crossed, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone. The others, Steve, Lila, Becca, had wisely disappeared, perhaps sensing that whatever was about to happen belonged only to the three of us and the jagged history that connected us like an old wound that never quite healed. No one spoke as I entered. The silence was so complete it felt sacred. I walked to my mother first, not out of reverence, but because I wanted to see her up close, to watch the moment her pride bent, even if it didn't break. I set the printed deed in front of her, the crisp paper sliding across the mahogany like a final verdict, and for the first time since childhood, I saw her hesitate, not dramatically, not with gasps or tears, but with the tiniest twitch in her left eye. The kind that betrays the presence of something uncontainable. "You're bluffing," Evan said, though his voice lacked conviction. I looked at him, not with disdain or anger, but with the kind of calm you only earn after realizing someone else's approval has no bearing on your self-worth. "It was never a game," I replied. "So there's nothing to bluff." Diana lifted the paper with fingers that trembled just enough to betray the magnitude of what she was holding, and as her eyes scanned the signature at the bottom, my signature, the one she had once told me I would never use for anything important, I watched something collapse inside her. Not dignity, not defiance, but certainty. And in its place came something that, for a fleeting second, looked like doubt. "You did all of this," she said quietly, "just to prove you could." "No," I said, and this was the part one meant with every atom of my being. "I did all of this so that you'd never again think you could control me with crumbs and condescension. I did it because I had to survive. And then, once I was done surviving, I built something better. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity." I leaned down, close enough for her to hear me without the others, and whispered the words I had spoken the night before, the same ones that had turned her to stone in the middle of that grand dinner. "I own more now than you ever did." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't even a threat. It was a truth that had been earned, not gifted, a truth sharpened by years of silence, honed by the refusal to settle for a life defined by someone else's idea of worth. I kissed her cheek then, not out of affection, but as a benediction, a kind of ceremonial end to the long war she never realized she had lost. When I turned to leave, Evan stepped forward as if to block me, but he stopped himself at the last moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, not hatred, not even resentment, but fear. Because he finally understood that the floor beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd believed, that the empire he thought would carry him forever had already begun to fracture, and that I, the sister he had dismissed as irrelevant, had not only returned, but had risen. I walked out into the sunlight, my heels clicking softly against the tile, echoing through the silence they had once used to erase me. Let them sit with that. Let them wonder how it happened, when it began, how they missed the signs. Let them turn it over in their minds, searching for the moment when the story slipped from their hands and into mine. Because I wasn't coming back. And the house behind me, my house now, stood quiet. But I had never been louder.